Your kids are so cheap, it's embarrassing. We don't want them at Thanksgiving. Those were the exact words my mother spat out, practically hissing through the phone. I remember gripping the receiver and just standing there, trying to process the blow. My heart began thudding against my chest as if sounding an alarm. In that charged moment, 1,000 thoughts collided in my mind. Were we really cheap, or was my mother simply projecting her own insecurities? My cheeks burned, not from shame, but from anger and heartbreak. It felt surreal, like I had stepped onto the set of some twisted soap opera. How could a family member, especially my own mother, dismiss my children so casually? I tried to speak, to form words of protest or confusion, but nothing came. The silence on my end must have sounded guilty to her, because she continued. Don't look so shocked. It's bad enough your father and I have to pretend we're not related to people who can't pull their weight. Your kids, well, they're embarrassing to be around. After she ended the call, I stood there, stunned, my phone buzzing with emptiness in my hand. My mind was blank, but my emotions raged like a storm, swirling and colliding. It wasn't as though this blow came out of nowhere. I'd known my parents had strong opinions about my lifestyle for years. Even so, they had never been quite this direct. I felt hot tears prick the corners of my eyes, partly from the insult and partly from the heartbreak of seeing how little regard they had for me and my children. My mother and father have always been supremely concerned with how we appear to the world. For them, everything is a reflection of status, a constant attempt to one-up the neighbors or impress distant relatives. I closed my eyes and recalled all those times they'd lecture me, telling me that appearances matter, that if you don't look successful, people won't believe you. Growing up under that mindset was exhausting, forever policing myself to ensure I didn't say or do something that would tarnish our reputation. And now, after all these years, my own kids had become an extension of that same judgment labeled cheap, simply because we live modestly. I felt anger coil in my gut. I knew I needed to stand up for my family, for my kids, for myself. But the question was, how? I texted my husband right after the call, my fingers trembling slightly. Mom just said we're not invited to Thanksgiving. She's calling the kids cheap. It felt absurd to even put those words on the screen, as though I might suddenly realize this was all a terrible misunderstanding. But deep down, I knew it wasn't. My mother's disdain was not new. It had just reached an unprecedented level of cruelty. My phone chimed within moments. What? Are you serious? My husband's immediate reaction mirrored mine. Shock, then hurt, then anger. We've always lived a life that made sense to us. We're frugal, sure, but we're not cheap. We teach our kids about budgeting and saving. We don't spend extravagantly on clothes or the latest gadgets. We believe in living well below our means, not because we can't afford more, but because we value long-term freedom over short-term indulgences. The fact that my own mother would interpret that as cheap was hurtful enough. But to exclude us from a family gathering, the biggest holiday of the year, felt like a line had been crossed. I could feel the sting of betrayal sinking into my bones, and with it, a steely resolve began to form. I wish I could say this was the first time my parents lashed out over something financial. It wasn't. They've always seen wealth as a performance. It's about big houses, flashy cars, and designer labels. Growing up, I remember that suffocating feeling whenever we visited the homes of my parents' wealthy friends. My mother would gently squeeze my arm and whisper, "Don't embarrass us." The rules were clear. Smile politely, say something nice about the decor, and never hint that we might prefer simpler things. My siblings and I were taught that the greatest crime was to appear poor, even if it meant racking up credit card debt behind the scenes. Over the years, I watched them belittle people who didn't measure up to their standards. Despite the facade, there was a gnawing emptiness in that world. I wanted no part of it. I moved out as soon as I could, building my own life away from that culture of constant comparison. But I should have expected the backlash. Every time I refused to play along, every time I chose to save or invest rather than spend, I drifted further from their idea of acceptable. Today's phone call was just the tipping point. As I sat on the edge of my bed, the phone call still echoing in my mind, I realized my feelings were shifting. What began as a wave of shock and sorrow was morphing into something else. anger mixed with a startling sense of clarity. My mother's words were harsh, but they also carried a twisted kind of truth about how she saw me and how she saw my children. For her, our entire life choice was a source of embarrassment. I knew then that the old, insecure version of me, the one that sought her approval, was gone for good. I felt protective of my children. They were innocent in all this, and they didn't deserve to be labeled cheap. I also felt a renewed commitment to the lifestyle my husband and I had carefully created. Why should I feel ashamed for teaching my kids about budgeting, for valuing meaningful experiences over possessions? If my parents couldn't see the merit in that, maybe they never would. And so, I dried my tears, took a deep breath, and decided that if they didn't want us at Thanksgiving, that was their loss. I was done feeling guilty for living by our own principles. Looking back, I can count dozens of times my family's disapproval surfaced in little digs and pointed remarks. One memory stands out. The day I bought a reliable used sedan, my mother's words still ring in my ears. "Why do you still have that car? You can afford something better, you know." She said it in front of my aunt and uncle, and I remember bristling under their collective gaze, feeling like a child who'd just been scolded for doing something foolish. Then there was the time we hosted a small family get-together at our modest home. We keep it clean and cozy, but it's definitely not the sprawling mansion my parents live in. As soon as my dad set foot inside, he commented, "Your house is so tiny. When are you upgrading?" As if living in a smaller space was automatically a sign of financial hardship. Meanwhile, we had chosen that home specifically because it had everything we needed and nothing we didn't. It was in a great neighborhood with good schools and ample parks nearby. But all they saw was a missed opportunity to flaunt. Each comment felt like a deliberate push, a challenge to our sense of worth. Then there's the matter of how my kids dress. My husband and I aren't fans of throwing money at brand-name clothes that they'll outgrow in a matter of months. We prioritize quality and durability over a fancy logo. But my parents, and honestly, much of my extended family, saw this as a failure on my part. Their cousins wear designer outfits, my mother would sniff. "Are you struggling to keep up?" At first, her words sliced into my pride. I'd question if I was somehow depriving my children or failing to give them the best. But my kids never complained. They were too busy enjoying life, playing sports, exploring museums, learning new things, to fixate on which brand name was on their shirt. Yet, every family gathering turned into an interrogation about when we'd finally step up. It was less about genuine concern and more about fulfilling some unwritten family code that screamed, "Wealth must be displayed." Each barb, each passive-aggressive question built up an invisible wall between me and my parents. I always felt on the defensive, always bracing for the next comment that would suggest we were doing life all wrong. As the years wore on, the pressure only got more intense. If I splurged on something my kids really wanted, like a trip to the science museum, my parents would say, "Why not Disneyland? That's more impressive." When I admitted that we had saved up to take the entire family on a low-key beach vacation, I got, "Is that all you can manage?" For them, bigger was always better. Bigger vacations, bigger cars, bigger houses. They were chasing a standard set, not by their own happiness, but by the collective opinion of other, elite families. Whenever we'd gather for holidays, the conversation inevitably turned into a subtle contest of who had recently bought something more extravagant. Even birthday parties were a battlefield. My sister would throw lavish events for her kids, complete with magicians, bounce houses, and catered food. The next day, my mother would come to me, shaking her head. "Why can't you do something similar? Don't you want your kids to have fun?" The implied message was clear. If it didn't shine, sparkle, and exceed everyone's expectations, it wasn't worth doing at all. Despite all this, I used to genuinely try to fit in for the sake of peace. I'd show up to these gatherings wearing something slightly more expensive, pretending that I was interested in their stories of lavish indulgence. I'd keep my mouth shut when they bragged about new cars or diamond jewelry. But the more I faked it, the more I felt an internal divide. It felt like I was lying to myself, and my children, about what matters in life. I'd wake up the day after a family event feeling drained and guilty, as though I had betrayed my own values. My husband would reassure me that we were doing the right thing by staying true to ourselves. And logically, I knew he was right. But emotionally, the weight of my parents' expectations bore down heavily on me. Maybe it was the little girl inside me who still wanted her mother's approval, who still wanted to be patted on the head and told, "You're making us proud." Only in this family, pride was tangled up with material success, and that seemed impossible for me to deliver. When I found out that we were excluded from Thanksgiving altogether, it was almost like a bizarre relief. Yes, the rejection stung, but it also felt liberating in a twisted way. Finally, the act was over. No more pretending, no more forced smiles. They had drawn a line in the sand. If I wouldn't comply with their version of financial showmanship, then I wasn't worthy of celebrating the holiday with them. It was a cruel stance, but also a clarifying one. In that clarity, I discovered a deeper emotional shift within me. Instead of a crushing sadness, I felt a strange surge of relief. They had shown their true colors, and I no longer had to guess where I stood. I began to see how flimsy their version of acceptance really was. It was always conditional. You're only part of the family if you behave like us, spend like us, and value what we value. Exclusion from that toxic dynamic, while painful, was also the first step toward truly living on my own terms. I dried my eyes, squared my shoulders, and decided I was done chasing their approval. What my family never realized or never bothered to ask was that my husband and I weren't living modestly out of necessity. We were doing it by choice, and ironically, that choice had turned us into millionaires. Yes, actual millionaires. But we never felt the need to broadcast it. Over the years, we'd carefully invested in real estate, buying undervalued properties and slowly building up a portfolio of rental homes. Each one was chosen with care, always focusing on potential growth rather than immediate curb appeal. While my family was busy buying oversized mansions in ritzy neighborhoods, draining their paychecks to keep up appearances, we were quietly accumulating assets. We'd reinvest every cent of profit back into renovations, property improvements, and new purchases. The result was a small empire, properties in multiple states, each one generating steady income. Meanwhile, we kept living in our comfortable 3-bedroom house in a pleasant neighborhood, driving our used cars and shopping the sales rack for school clothes. All the while, our net worth ballooned, year after year, all under the radar of my image-conscious family. We just never saw the point in bragging about it. In addition to our rental properties, we owned a sprawling estate in the countryside, a place we treated like a secret refuge from the chaos of our busy lives. We'd purchased it years ago, after a particularly successful real estate deal, but we never told anyone. Surrounded by acres of rolling hills, it was the perfect spot to unwind and connect with nature. The estate wasn't just a trophy home, it was a sanctuary. We'd hike the wooded trails, fish in the private pond, and host laid-back weekend barbecues for our closest friends. It was our little piece of heaven, and in a world obsessed with social media and one-upmanship, we chose to keep it private. There were no selfies plastered online, no "look at how grand our life is" moments. It was for us, plain and simple. Sometimes I'd imagine what my mother would do if she ever discovered it. She would probably swoon at the grandeur, then scold me for not flaunting it enough. But that's not how we operated. We wanted real, lasting fulfillment, not just a fleeting show. The estate was a testament to our belief that you can enjoy life deeply without turning it into a spectacle. In the wake of that exclusion from Thanksgiving, I felt an unanticipated surge of resolve. If my family refused to welcome my children and me, I would craft a holiday gathering on my own terms, one that celebrated gratitude, connection, and genuine warmth. And what better place than our private estate? That same day, I called up my closest friends and some business associates who genuinely appreciated our financial wisdom. "We're hosting our own Thanksgiving," I announced, my voice trembling with a mixture of excitement and nerves. No dress code, no forced formalities, just good food and meaningful company. They responded with enthusiasm. Many of them were also tired of superficial gatherings and yearned for something more authentic. The plan began to take shape. A roaring fireplace, a long wooden table dressed with homemade dishes, and plenty of laughter echoing across the property. As I made the guest list, I realized how many wonderful people I had in my life. People who respected and admired us for who we were, not for the brand of clothes we wore or the car we drove. For the first time, I felt the holiday spirit coursing through me, untainted by family drama and pretense. I'll never forget the look on my kids' faces when I told them about our new Thanksgiving plan. They were initially confused. "Aren't we going to Grandma's like we do every year?" my daughter asked. But I gently explained that Grandma and Grandpa had other ideas this time. Instead of letting the conversation dwell on rejection, I emphasized the excitement of creating something new. "We're going to host our own celebration," I said, smiling as I pulled them close. "We'll have a huge turkey, and you can even pick your favorite pies." Their eyes lit up with delight. My son immediately started suggesting games and activities we could organize for our friends' kids who would be joining us. I could sense the resilience in them, how quickly they bounced back from potential hurt. That's when I realized we'd done something right in raising them. They weren't tying their self-worth to expensive clothing or elaborate parties. They just wanted to be with people who cared about them. In that moment, I felt an almost overwhelming gratitude. Rejection by my parents had ironically opened the door to a deeper, more genuine Thanksgiving experience, one where the true spirit of gratitude could flourish. As the plans came together, I felt a calm confidence settle over me. I wasn't seeking revenge. I wasn't even particularly angry anymore. Instead, I felt liberated. My identity no longer hinged on familial acceptance. This was my life, my decisions, and my family's well-being. I started envisioning our private estate lit by the soft glow of lanterns, the long dinner table loaded with homemade dishes, and the echo of children's laughter in the air. I found myself daydreaming about the hearty embraces between friends who had supported us through thick and thin, the clinking of glasses in toasts that celebrated real friendship and shared values. The more I planned, the more I understood that we had the power to create memories far richer than any showy event. For years, I'd subjected myself to the emotional roller coaster of my parents' judgments. But now, freed from that tether, I felt a profound sense of peace. The fact that my parents would be glaring at an empty seat at their table didn't fill me with spiteful joy. It was simply an inevitable consequence of their narrow worldview. We had parted ways with their vision of success, and there was no going back. It was a few days after I'd sent out my Thanksgiving invitations that I received a frantic call from my brother. "Hey, is this you?" he asked, panting like he had just run a marathon. I could almost see the sweat on his forehead through the phone. Confused, I asked him what he meant. "I saw your name associated with a property listing, a gated mansion. I was online looking at real estate and your name popped up." My heart did a little flip. Despite all my careful secrecy, there it was. My name, linked to the estate in a public record. My brother demanded details. "Why didn't you tell us about this? Does Mom know?" He sounded a mixture of jealous, intrigued, and angry. I told him calmly that, yes, it was ours, and no, we hadn't told anyone because it was our personal retreat. His silence on the other end of the line stretched uncomfortably. I imagined him staring at his computer screen, rereading the listing, grappling with disbelief. Here I was, the cheap sibling, secretly owning a luxurious property. The irony wasn't lost on me. After a long pause, he muttered, I had no idea," and hung up. From that moment on, word spread like wildfire through my family. My phone buzzed nonstop with calls and texts, not only from my brother, but also from cousins, aunts, and uncles who had somehow gotten wind of the news. "Is this true?" they'd ask, half disbelieving, half curious. "How did you afford a place like that?" My mother, who had been avoiding me since our last conversation, suddenly resurfaced. Her voice had taken on a strange, soft quality, like she was treading on eggshells. "Dear, your brother mentioned something about a large property. Is that yours?" Her question hung in the air, heavy with all the unspoken assumptions and accusations she'd hurled at me for years. I felt a wave of conflicting emotions, a bit of triumph, a bit of sorrow, but mostly indifference. I simply affirmed that yes, the estate was ours, that we'd owned it for quite some time, and we enjoyed keeping it private. Her audible gasp on the other end told me everything. All those times she labeled us cheap, she had no clue what we were really doing with our money. And now that she knew, her entire perception was crumbling. The family group chat exploded. Accusations flew in from relatives I hadn't heard from in years, some implying that we must have been lying or pretending. Others congratulated us with a forced politeness that dripped of envy. My mother, trying to regain her composure, texted me separately, asking if she could visit the property. She said she wanted to see it with her own eyes. A surreal thought struck me. The same woman who had excluded my children from Thanksgiving because they wore ordinary clothes was now groveling for an invitation to my luxurious estate. I could almost hear the frantic gears turning in her head as she tried to reconcile the two versions of me, the cheap daughter and the savvy real estate investor. In a different world, I might have found this comedic, but it mostly felt sad, a confirmation that her love and acceptance hinged on material revelations. Still, I was calm. I had no interest in revenge or flaunting anything. My mother wanted an explanation for how we did it, and I told her, we saved, we invested, we lived below our means. The line went quiet again. I could sense her disbelief, tinged with something that sounded almost like regret. She tried to apologize in her own awkward way. You know, she began, if we had known you had these assets, we never would have. I felt my chest tighten. She was about to say it, called your kids cheap. I could have pressed her, demanded a more heartfelt apology, or lectured her on how cruel those words were. But what good would it do? An apology driven by new knowledge of my wealth would never erase the pain she inflicted. So I swallowed the sting and listened, allowing her to grasp at justifications. We only wanted what was best for you, she claimed, her voice trembling with what might have been genuine remorse, or maybe just embarrassment. I was reminded of all those moments when she'd equated best with most expensive, and a fresh wave of realization washed over me. Our values were fundamentally different. She couldn't comprehend a life that wasn't about display and grandeur. When she asked why I never told them about the estate, I answered simply, because it shouldn't matter how much money we have. It matters who we are and how we live. She responded with a heavy silence, and for the first time I detected uncertainty in her. In the following days, I noticed a drastic shift in my parents' demeanor. My father reached out, uncharacteristically contrite, saying he'd like to make amends. Even my siblings, who used to roll their eyes at our boring lifestyle, suddenly wanted to know more about investing. It felt like they finally saw me as an equal, maybe even someone to look up to. Yet that realization also carried a bitter aftertaste, because it was all triggered by the discovery of my material success. Their acceptance wasn't based on a newfound respect for my choices. It was rooted in the fact that I had, in their eyes, arrived. And that told me everything I needed to know about their values. They respected money, not the wisdom or character behind it. As my husband and I continued finalizing our Thanksgiving plans, we heard the strangest rumor. Apparently, my parents were quietly telling extended relatives that we'd had some big financial breakthrough. They were crafting a narrative that made sense to them, something along the lines of, they finally started earning real money. The irony was laughable. We'd been doing well for years. We just didn't measure success by the same yardstick they did. As Thanksgiving approached, I received another call from my mother. This time, her tone was not just soft, it was almost pleading. She explained that she'd canceled the original Thanksgiving plans with the extended family and wanted my family and me to come back to the table. We want you here. We realize we've made mistakes, she confessed. But every word sounded hollow in my ear. I couldn't help but wonder, if my brother hadn't stumbled upon that real estate listing, would they have softened at all? Would we still be unwelcome, labeled as embarrassments for living a lifestyle they couldn't fathom? The question swirled in my head, but the answer seemed obvious. They were only reversing course because they discovered I wasn't truly poor. And that realization stung more than the initial insult. I thanked her politely but told her we'd already had plans. She seemed flustered, promising that we'll make it up to you and that I should think about the kids. They want to be with their grandparents. Yet, I remained firm. My children deserved an environment where they were cherished unconditionally, not tolerated for their perceived net worth. On the morning of our Thanksgiving celebration, my husband and I packed the car with fresh groceries, homemade pies, and the kids' favorite board games. As we drove toward our estate, I felt an undercurrent of peace and resolve that I'd never experienced before. The road was lined with autumn leaves, a blend of reds, oranges, and yellows, almost like nature itself was celebrating our newfound clarity. My phone buzzed with messages from my mother, father, and a few other relatives, all asking for a chance to join us, just to see the property, or spend time together as a family. But I ignored those texts. Not out of malice, but out of self-protection. This Thanksgiving was about forging deeper bonds with the people who respected us for who we were. When we finally reached the estate, our kids jumped out of the car and raced toward the front door, squealing with joy. My heart swelled at the sight. They weren't excited because the house was large or lavish. They were excited for the fellowship, the laughter, and the promise of a day filled with warmth and gratitude. That was what mattered. Friends and colleagues arrived soon after. Some were longtime pals who'd known about our hidden estate. Others had no idea we owned such a place. Regardless, their reactions were filled with genuine awe rather than envy or judgment. Each guest contributed a dish to the feast, potluck style, and soon the entire kitchen was brimming with delectable aromas: roast turkey, creamy mashed potatoes, homemade cranberry sauce, and pies galore. The fireplace crackled in the living room, casting dancing shadows on the walls. Children played tag out on the lawn, their laughter echoing through the corridors. I felt a lump in my throat as I watched people settle into comfortable chairs, chatting about everything from personal dreams to travel stories. Nobody was talking about how expensive someone's watch was or what brand of purse they carried. This wasn't about showing off. It was about sharing. At one point, a close friend raised a toast. She said, "Here's to living authentically, to building wealth in more ways than one, and to never letting others dictate our worth." Glasses clinked, and I took a moment to let her words sink in. Authenticity and true wealth. That's what this day represented. Later in the evening, after most of the guests had gone, I wandered out onto the porch with a mug of hot cider. The moonlight bathed the rolling hills in a silvery glow. My husband joined me, wrapping an arm around my shoulders, and we stood there in comfortable silence for a few minutes. Finally, he asked, "Do you regret not sharing this with your family earlier?" I thought about it and realized the answer was simple. No, I don't. Perhaps if they had found out earlier, our estate would have become a tool for their one-upmanship. We would have been dragged into a never-ending cycle of forced displays. By keeping it hidden, we got to enjoy it purely for ourselves, free from their judgments and manipulations. And yes, we faced rejection from them, but that rejection was a gift in disguise. It illuminated their conditional love and allowed us to grow beyond it. "I'm happy we did it this way," I murmured, watching a soft breeze ripple through the trees. My husband nodded, a quiet agreement that sometimes the path less traveled is the one that leads to the most genuine peace. In the days and weeks that followed, I received more calls and messages from my family. Some were apologetic, others defensive, but all were tinged with desperation to rebuild a bridge they themselves had burned. Perhaps in time I'll seek a more peaceful resolution, but for now, I keep them at a distance. My focus is on my children and the life we've built, a life grounded in values far deeper than vanity. Reflecting on it all, I recall how my parents prided themselves on teaching me about money when I was young. They'd lecture me about salaries, about job titles, about looking the part of a successful person. But they never taught me about true wealth, wealth of spirit, of freedom, of self-respect. They never showed me that it's possible to have everything you need without showing it off to the world. Standing here, looking out over our property, I feel a sense of vindication and gratitude rolled into one. I'm living proof that you can transcend a toxic family narrative and find your own way. And so, I leave you with this final reflection, the ultimate lesson I've learned. They taught me about money, but they never taught me about wealth.